So guys, we're coming to our last presentation. Our final presentation comes to us from the Elizabeth C. Miller Botanic Garden, located along the shore of the Puget Sound in Seattle, Washington. I need to give a humongous thank you to Richie and Dell for putting this together in such short notice. If there is one thing I know about IPPS, it's you can count on fellow members when you need them for help. We had a tour drop out. These guys stepped right in. I greatly appreciate it. And let's start the final presentation for today.
Welcome to the Elizabeth C. Miller Botanical Garden. I'm Richie Steffen, Executive Director, and your tour guide through our beautiful space. The Miller Garden is the former estate of the Pendleton and Elizabeth C. Miller. The Millers purchased the property in 1948, and the Botanical Garden became established in 1994 upon Mrs. Miller's death. The garden contains Mrs. Miller's extensive collections, including many rare and unusual plants. We continue to maintain and develop the collection with additional cultivars and species that are suited to our maritime Pacific Northwest climate. Mrs. Miller was also passionate about education and advocated for planting the right plant in the right space. Inspired by this passion, the Miller Garden created Great Plant Picks. GPP is an educational resource for the maritime Pacific Northwest, helping people find reliable plants for our region. The garden staff works with horticultural experts from Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia around Vancouver who volunteer their time and expertise to select and evaluate plants that are truly proven performers. As we tour the Miller Garden, we'll see some of Mrs. Miller's favorite plants as well as some new additions noted for their rarity and unusual characteristics. The garden is divided into 4 distinct areas, each providing its own unique plant habitat. The Miller house is surrounded by planting beds focusing on containers, texture, and form. The dry bank, one of the sunnier locations in the garden, and contains many plants from Mediterranean and modified climates. The lower garden is the last area that Mrs. Miller worked on before her death. This area is a mix of sun and shade and generally has a less restrained appearance, allowing for bolder foliage and more exuberant growth. The last area is the upper woodlands. This is the first area that Mrs. Miller focused her attention on after moving to the property. This classic Northwest garden contains mature native conifers ranging from 100 to 125 years old with a rich tapestry of plants in the understory. This area, the upper woodland, is where we'll start our tour. Mrs. Miller embraced using vines from the beginning. She enjoyed climbing hydrangea, and we have several different climbing species in the garden, including this rare evergreen hydrangea relative, Paleostegia viburnioides. Rhododendrons were a favorite. Her preference was for species and near species hybrids. Her main interest in these plants was for their beautiful foliage and flowers were a mere afterthought. A spectacular addition to the garden is the near species hybrid Sir Charles Lemon. The exact detail of this hybrid is lost, but it is thought to have been raised from seeds sent by Sir Joseph Dalton Hooker from his work in India in the mid-1800s. Another species with quite different foliage is Rhododendron oldhamii. This June flowering Taiwan evergreen azalea has unusual soft fuzzy foliage with reddish golden hairs. The flowers are brick red. The mature conifer overstory consists of grand fir, Abies grandis, western red cedar, Thuya plicata, and Douglas fir, Pseudotsuga menziesii. To maintain the feel of a Pacific Northwest woodland, native shrubs were added to unify plantings. Vaccinium ovatum evergreen huckleberry was used widely and allowed to reseed. One of our best natives for landscape use, the dark green leaves are fully evergreen and shiny in appearance with white to pink flowers in spring, followed by delicious dark purple to glaucous blueberries in late summer, early autumn. Another useful native plant throughout is Mahonia nervosa, Cascade Oregon grape. A bold leaf ground cover, it is tolerant of dark, dry shade and produces fragrant flowers in spring, followed by showy glaucous blueberries. Polystichum unitum sword fern is throughout the garden. This extremely useful fern is evergreen and adapted to a wide range of conditions. It is a key component of our substantial fern collection. The Miller Garden contains over 200 different species and cultivars of ferns. One of the best of these is the Victorian cultivar Polystichum sativum bevis. Named after the gardener who discovered it, this robust grower can reach 3 to 4 feet in height and width at maturity. The garden is a haven for local wildlife, especially native birds. Snags are left to create habitat for animals such as these pileated woodpeckers. One of Mrs. Miller's favorite trees is Acer japonicum aconitifolium, cutleaf full moon maple or fernleaf maple, a beautiful tree that is well suited to the urban garden, noted for its gracefully rugged branching habit and spectacular fall color. Over 25 of these are scattered through the garden. As we leave the upper woodlands, we head towards the house, where you can see that foliage and form were critical considerations for the Millers. Influenced by the naturalistic pruning of Japanese gardens, she would take care to shape plants from a young age. This is well illustrated in the Incanthus campanulatus. The branches have a sculptural quality accentuated by its natural growth habit. Mrs. Miller's desire for a year-round garden focused on combining foliage, texture, and form. Several trees were selected for their attractive bark. A classic example is Stewartia pseudocamellia, Japanese Stewartia, with flaky bark creating a patchwork of earthy tones. Other trees planted nearby are the smooth gray bark copper beech, Vagus sylvatica purpurea, and near that is an Acer palmatum araucaria, one of the pine bark maples. Here the bold lanceolate foliage of Cordyline indivisa is in stark contrast with the palmate leaves of Schefflera taiwaniana. Both are complemented by the soft fern foliage below. The Cordyline indivisa mountain cabbage tree is an experimental plant for the garden. These extraordinary plants can be finicky and have a distinct dislike for excessive heat, excessive water, and extended drought. Each leaf can reach 8 inches wide and 4.5 feet long at maturity. As gardens mature, there's an inevitable change. The southern half of our lawn was gradually shaded out. Appreciating that the open green space gave the eye a place to rest, the grass was replaced with ground cover fern Adiantum venustum, Himalayan maidenhair. Haconocloa macroaureola is in a large clump off the main lawn. The golden Japanese forest grass is a beautiful ornamental and was introduced to North America by Mrs. Miller and is now produced by micropropagation by the hundreds of thousands. Unlike some micropropagated plants, the original clump never reverts, and the garden has shared divisions with tissue culture producers to provide fresh propagation material. library terrace is an extremely protected indoor-outdoor space that allows us to dabble with some Zone 9 plants. This space showcases several tender rhododendrons as well as many other plants best displayed in containers. One vine of particular interest is Larda Isabella biternata. Mrs. Miller was the first to grow this in North America, and it is an unusual addition to for its late season flowers. The dining room terrace is a recently redesigned area of the garden that features bold container plantings and diverse alpine trough planters. Alpine plants were a passion of Mrs. Miller, and we enthusiastically share this passion. Our troughs contain a mix of true alpines with dwarf lowland species. All of these are planted in very gravelly, well-drained soil with low nutrient levels to minimize growth. Cool summer temperatures, especially cool summer nights, allow us to grow a wide range of high elevation species. One of our favorites is Salix boydii. Discovered only once in the wild, it is thought to be a hybrid between two subarctic species, Salix lanata and Salix reticulata. A 10-year-old specimen of this dwarf willow barely exceeds 1 foot in height. Another choice mountain dweller is Epigea asiatica, with a common name of Iwanashi, growing low and tight to the ground in mid-spring and has bright pink tubular flowers that peek out from between the foliage. The specialized growing conditions of our troughs allow us to try some xeric ferns. These dryland ferns can be quite challenging in our moist northwest climate, but surprisingly, Bomeria hispida copper fern has grown well for several years. This slow-growing spreading fern is native to Arizona, New Mexico, and western Texas. It requires exceptional drainage with regular watering during summer and protection from excessive winter rains. As we move into the lower garden, you are greeted by several Fothergilla ex intermedia, witch alder, one of Mrs. Miller's favorite shrubs for autumn color. Autumn also brings the delightful fragrance, apricot fragrance of Osmanthus fortunii. This large evergreen shrub is loaded with tiny, powerfully fragrant flowers from September to early November. Climbing one of our deodar cedars is Vitis Rogers Red, a naturally occurring hybrid between Vitis californica and Vitis vinifera, the wine grape. It has beautiful, long-lasting fall colors, although our plant will soon need to be reduced to keep it from swamping our cedar. One of our garden favorites is Quercus pontica, the Pontic oak or Armenian oak. This large multi-branch shrub is tough and drought tolerant. The bold leathery foliage is beautiful and makes a clean, tidy appearance. Pinus sabiniana, gray pine or ghost pine, has graceful, long, weeping needles on an open, airy branch. It is an endemic to California. This pine is completely drought tolerant, but caution must be used in planting this tree. Large spiny cones weighing over a pound can drop unexpectedly and strike the ground with a heavy thud. The lower garden is dominated by an enormous canyon live oak, Quercus chrysolepis. Planted as a seedling by Mrs. Miller, it is now one of the largest in the Northwest. Topping over 80 feet in height and 60 feet in diameter, its massive framework of branches are alive with activity in fall as stellar jays and squirrels eagerly devour its acorns. Protected by the shade of the canyon live oak grows one of the garden's rarest treasures, Gaultheria wardii. Acquired decades ago by Mrs. Miller, at the time of her death, it was the only one in North America. We have now propagated and shared this clone with other gardens and nurseries, as well as added more plants to the garden. The Miller Garden ends at the overlook. This wooden deck holds a collection of contained specimens as well as offers spectacular views out onto Puget Sound. Much of our Pyrosia fern collection is displayed at the overlook. Pyrosia or felt ferns are primarily from the southern hemisphere and Southeast Asia. We collect hardy species and cultivars of this odd genus. One of the most impressive fern plantings in the garden is our large patch of Blechnum chilense. First introduced into North America by Mrs. Miller, many of the plants in cultivation within the US and Canada can be traced back to divisions shared by Mrs. Miller from the garden. Under ideal conditions, their rigid evergreen fronds can grow to 5 to 6 feet tall. From 2006 to 2010, the Miller Garden acquired 5 Wallemia nobilis, Wallemi pines, native to the Blue Mountains of Australia. These trees have been surprisingly hardy in our climate, with them reaching over 20 feet in height and regularly producing male and female cones. The garden has a small nursery area where we grow plants from seed and cuttings. We have embarked on a propagation project for ferns in cooperation with the Hardy Fern Foundation. The goal of the program is to propagate and distribute some rare species and cultivars to make them more firmly established in cultivation. Spore is sparingly spread over sterile potting soil and with luck produces prothallai. The regularly misting of water is made at this time to encourage fertilization and the continued development to sporophytes. These sporophytes are transplanted into flats, and once established, these flats are then taken to the Hardy Fern Foundation for growing on to maturity. Here is an example of one of our young ferns propagated from spore. Thanks for tuning in and enjoying this virtual tour of the Elisabeth Miller Botanical Garden. Please be sure to check out our websites to find out more about our institution.
International sponsors like Harrell's and Ball. National sponsors, Nursery Supplies, Star Roses and Plants, Bailey Nurseries, Spring Meadow Nursery, ICL Specialty Fertilizer, and Bayer. And our most recent regional sponsor, I'd like to give a plug for the support of Van Bell Nursery.